Chapter 2.
Tostitos. Tostitos.
The kids are eating chips. They're very happy about it. Honor those the dragons heed, in thought and favor, word and deed. Worlds are lost or worlds are saved from those dangers dragon braved. Dragon man, avoid excess. Greed will bring the weir distress. To the ancient law adhere, prospers thus the dragon weir.
Such a creative name.
Dragon weir?
Dragon Man.
Oh.
Such a creative name.
Mm.
Totally.
It was easy enough at first for Manoli to forget her tuning during the teachings. She wanted to do Paterion proud so that when the new harper came, he'd find no fault in the children's recitations. The children were attentive. The teaching was always better than gutting and preserving fish, or net mending and long-line baiting. Then, too, winter storms, the severest in many turns, kept the fishing fleet docked, and the teaching eased the boredom. When the fleet was in, Yanis would stop by the little hall where Manoli held her class. He'd scowl at her from the back of the hall. Fortunately, he'd only stay a little while because he made the children nervous. Once she actually saw his foot tapping the beat. He scowled when he realized what he was doing, and then he left. He had sent the message sloop to Egan Hold 3 days after the burial. The crew brought back news of no interest to Manoli, but the adults went around looking black, something about the old-timers, and Manoli wasn't to worry her head, so she didn't. The crew also brought back a message slate addressed to Paterion and signed with the imprint of Master Harper Robinson. Poor old Paterion, one of the aunties told Manoli, sighing and dabbing affectedly at her eyes. He always looked forward to slates from Master Harper. Ah, well, it'll keep till the new Harper comes. He'll know what to do with it. It took Manoli a while to find out where the slate was, propped up conspicuously on the mantel in her father's records room. Manoli was positive that the message had something to do with her, with the songs that Paterion had said he'd sent to the Master Harper. The notion so obsessed her that she got bold enough to ask her mother why Yanis didn't open the message. Open a sealed message from the Master Harper to a man dead? Mavi stared at her daughter in shocked incredulity. Your father would do no such thing. Harper's letters are for Harpers. I only remembered that Paterion had sent a slate to the Master Harper. I thought it might be about a replacement coming. I mean, I'll be glad when the new Harper does come, my girl. You've been getting above yourself with this teaching. The next few days were full of apprehension for Manoli. She conceived the idea that her mother would make Yanis replace her as teacher. That was, of course, impossible for the same reasons that had forced Yanis to make her the teacher in the first place. But it was a fact that Mavi found all the smelliest, most boring or tedious jobs for Manoli once her teaching duty was done, and Yanis took it into his head to appear in the little hall more frequently. Then the weather settled down into a clear spell, and the entire sea hold was kept at a run with fish. The children were excused from the teaching to gather seaweeds blown up by the high tides, and all the hold women set to boiling the weed for the thick juice in the stalks, juice that kept back many sicknesses and bone ailments. Or so the old aunties said. But they'd find good out of any bad and the worst of any blessing. And the worst of the seaweed was its smell, thought Manoli, who had to stir the huge kettles. Threadfalls came and added some excitement. The fear in being hold-bound while the dragons swept the skies with their fiery breath, charring thread to impotence. Manoli wanted to see that grand sight one day instead of just singing about it, or knowing it was taking place outside the thick stone walls and the heavy metal shutters of the hold's windows. Afterward, she joined the flamethrower crews that checked for any possible thread that might have escaped dragon flame. Not that there was much for thread to eat on the wind-swept bare marshes and bogs around Half-Circle Seahold. The barren rock palisades that made Half-Circle bore no greenery at all, winter or summer, but it was wise to check the marshes and beaches. Thread could burrow into the seagrass stalks, or slide down the marshberry and sea beach plum bushes, burrow into the roots, multiply, and eat anything green and growing until the coast was as bare as rock. Flame crewing was cold work, but it was a distinct pleasure for Manoli to be out of the hold in the rough air. Her team got as far as the Dragonstones to the south. Paterion had told her that those stones, standing offshore in the treacherous waters, had once been part of the palisade, probably hollowed with cliffs like all this stretch of cliff. The crowning treat for Manoli was when the weir leader, Flar himself, on bronze Menmouth, circled in for a chat with Yanis. Of course, Manoli wasn't near enough to hear what the two men said, but she was close enough to smell the firestone reek of the giant bronze dragon, close enough to see his beautiful eyes catching all colors in the pale wintry sunlight, to see his muscles knot and smooth under the soft hide. Manoli stood, as was properly respectful, with the other flamethrower crews, but once, when the dragon turned his head in a lazy fashion to peer in her direction, his eyes whirled slowly with their changing colors, and she was certain that Menman looked at her. She didn't dare breathe. He was so beautiful. Then suddenly the magic moment was over. Flar gave a graceful leap to the dragon's shoulder, caught the flat fighting straps, and pulled himself into place on the neck ridges. Air whooshed around Manoli and the others as the great bronze opened his fragile-looking wings. The next moment, he seemed to be in the air, catching the updraft, beating steadily higher. Abruptly, the dragon winked from view. Manoli was not the only one to sigh deeply. To see a dragon rider in the sky was always an occurrence. To be on the same ground with a dragger and his rider, to witness his graceful takeoff and exit between, was a marvel. All the songs about dragon riders and dragons seemed inadequate to Manoli. She stole up to the little cubicle in the women's dormitory that she shared with Sella. She wanted to be alone. She had a little pipe among her things, a soft, whispery reed pipe, and she began to play it, a little whistle composed of her excitement and her response to the day's lovely event. "So there you are." Sella flounced into the room, her face reddened, her breath rough. She'd obviously run up the steep stairs. "Told Mavi you'd be here." Sella grabbed the little pipe from Manoli's fingers. "And tuning, too." "Oh, Sella, it's an old tune," Manoli said mendaciously and grabbed her pipe back.
How dare she?
Her sister? Yeah. Sella's jaw worked with anger. "Old my foot. I know your ways, girl, and you're dodging work. You get back to the kitchen. You're needed now." "I am not dodging work. I taught this morning during Threadfall, and then I had to go with the crews." "Your crew's been in this past half day or more, and you still in smelly, sandy clothes, mucking up the room I have to sleep in. You get below, or I'll tell Yanis you've been tuning." That was the alarm. "Ha! You wouldn't know a tune if you had your nose rubbed in it." But Manoli was shedding her work clothes as fast as she could. Sella was just likely to slip the word to Mavi. Her sister was as wary of Yanis as Manoli, about Manoli piping in her room, a suspicious action on its own, though Manoli hadn't sworn not to tune at all, only not to do it in front of people. However, everyone was in a good mood that night. Yanis, because he'd spoken to Flar the Weir Leader, and because there'd be good fishing on the morrow if the weather held. Fish always rose to feed from drowned thread, and half the fall had been over Narat Bay. The deep would be thick with schools. With Yanis in a good mood, the rest of the sea holders could also rejoice, because there'd been no thread on the ground at all. So it wasn't any wonder that they called Manoli to play for them. She sang 2 of the longer sagas about dragons, and then did the name song for the current wing leaders of Bend and Weir, so her sea-hold would know their dragon men. She wondered if there'd been a recent hatching that Half Circle mightn't have heard about, being so isolated, but she was certain that Flar would have told Yanis if that were so. But would Yanis have told Manoli? She wasn't the harper to be told such things as courtesy. The sea holders wanted more singing, but her throat was tired, so she played them a song they could sing, bellowing out the words in voices roughened by wind and salt. She saw her father scowling at her, though he was singing along with the rest of them, and she wondered if he didn't want her, a mere girl, to play men's songs. It galled her because she'd played them often enough when Paterion was alive. She sighed at this injustice, and then wondered what Flar would have said if he'd known that Half Circle Seahold was dependent on a mere girl for their harpering. She'd heard everyone say that Flar was a fair man, a far-singing man, and a fine dragon rider. There were even songs about him and his weirwoman, Lessa. So she sang them, in honor of the Weird Leader's visit, and her father's expression lightened. She sang on until her throat was so tight that not a squeak would come out. She wished that someone else could play to give her a rest, but as she scanned the faces of the holders, there wasn't any of them who could beat a drum properly, much less finger a guitar or pipe. That was why the next day it seemed only logical for her to start one of the children learning the drum rolls. Plenty of songs could be sung just to drum beat, and one of Surreal's 2 children, still in teaching, was sensitive enough to learn pipe. Someone, Sella perhaps, Manoli thought bitterly, informed Mavi of Manoli's activity. "You were told no tuning." teaching someone drum beats is not tuning. Teaching anyone to play is harper business, not yours, my girl. Just your good fortune sea holder is out in the deep, or you'd have the belt across your shoulders, so you would. No more nonsense. But it's not nonsense, Mabby. Last night another drummer or piper would have... Her mother raised her hand in warning, and Manoli bit shut her lips. No tuning, Manoli. And that was that. Now, girls, see to the glows before the fleet gets back. That job took Manoli inexorably to the Harper's room, swept clean of everything that had been personal to Paterian. She was also reminded of the sealed message on the record room mantel. What if the Master Harper were expecting a message from Paterian about the songmaker? Manoli was so very sure that part of that unopened message was about her. Not that thinking about it did Manoli any good. Even knowing it for a fact would be no help, Manoli decided gloomily. But that didn't stop her from going past Yanis's record room and peering in at the tempting package on the mantel. She sighed, turning from the room. By now the Master Harper would have heard of Paterian's death and be sending a new Harper. Maybe the new man would be able to open the message, and maybe, if it was about her, maybe if it said that the songs she'd sent were good ones, Yanis and her mother wouldn't put such restrictions on her about tuning and whistling and everything. As the winter spun itself out, Manoli found that her sense of loss when she thought of Paterian deepened. He had been the only person in the Sea-Hold who had ever encouraged her in anything, and most especially in that one thing she was now forbidden to do. Melodies didn't stop growing in the mind, tapping at fingers just because they're forbidden, and Manoli didn't stop composing them, which she felt was not precisely disobeying. What seemed to worry Yanis and Mabby most, Manoli reasoned to herself, was the fact that the children, whom she was supposed to teach only the proper ballads and sagas, might think Manoli's tunes were harper-crafted. If her tunes were that good in her parents' ears, what was the harm of them? Basically, they didn't want her to play her songs aloud where they would be heard and perhaps repeated at awkward times. Manoli could therefore see no harm in writing down new tunes. She played them softly in the empty little hall when the children had left, before she began her afternoon chores, carefully hiding her notations among the Harper records in the rack of the hall. Safe enough, for no one but herself till the new Harper came would discover them there. This mild deviation from the absolute obedience to her father's restriction about tuning did much to ease Manoli's growing frustration and loneliness. What Manoli didn't realize was that her mother had been watching her closely, having recognized the signs of rebellion in her. Mabby didn't want the hold to be disgraced in any way, and she feared that Manoli, her head turned by Paterian's marked favor, was not mature enough to discipline herself. Sella had warned her mother that Manoli was getting out of hand. Mabby put some of that tale down to sisterly envy. But when Sella had told Mabby that Manoli had actually...
It bothered me.
Well, please stop.
Okay.
But when Sella had told Mabby that Manoli had actually started to teach another how to play an instrument, Mabby had been obliged to intervene. Let Yanis get one whisper of Manoli's disobedience and there'd be real trouble in the hold for the girl. Spring was coming, and with spring the quieter... Hold on just a second. Spring was coming, and with spring the quieter seas. Perhaps the new Harper would arrive soon. And then spring did come. A first glorious day. The sweet scents of sea beach plum and marshberry filled the seaward breezes and came in through the open shutters of the little hall. The children were singing loudly, as if shouting got them through the learning faster. True, they were singing one of the longer sagas, word perfect, but with far more exuberance than was strictly needed. Perhaps it was that exuberance that infected Manoli and reminded her of a tune she'd tried to set down the day before. She did not consciously disobey. She certainly was unaware that the fleet had returned from an early catch. She was equally unaware that the chords she was strumming were not officially of the Harper's craft, and it was doubly unfortunate that this lapse occurred just as the sea-holder passed the open windows of the hall. He was in the little hall almost at once, summarily dismissing the youngsters to help unload the heavy catch. Then he silently, which made the anticipation of the punishment worse, removed his wide belt, signaled Manoli to raise her tunic over her head, and to bend over the high Harper stool. When he had finished, she had fallen to her knees on the hard stone flags, biting her lips to keep back the sobs. He'd never beaten her so hard before. The blood was roaring in her ears so fiercely that she didn't hear Yanis leave the little hall. It was a long while before she could ease the tunic over the painful wheals on her back. Only when she'd got slowly to her feet did she realize that he'd taken the guitar, too. She knew then that his judgment was irrevocable and harsh. And unjust. She'd only played the first few bars, hummed along, and that only because the last chords of the teaching ballad had modified into the new tune in her head. Surely that little snitch wouldn't have done any lasting harm? And the children knew all the teaching ballads they were supposed to know. She hadn't meant to disobey Yanis. Manoli? Her mother came to the class hall door, the carrying thong of an empty skin in her hand. You dismissed them early? Is that wise? Her mother stopped abruptly and stared at her daughter. An expression of anger and disgust crossed her face. So you've been the fool after all. With so much at stake, and you had to tune. I didn't do it on purpose, Mavi. The song just came into my mind. I'd played no more than a measure. There wasn't any point in trying to justify the incident to her mother. Not now. The desolation Manoli had felt when she realized her father had taken the guitar intensified in the face of her mother's cold displeasure. Take the sack. We need fresh greens, Mavi said in an expressionless voice, and any of the yellow-veined grass that might be up. There should be some. Resignedly, Manoli took the sack and, without thinking, looped the thong over her shoulder. She caught her breath as the unwieldy sack banged against her scored back. Before Manoli could avoid it, her mother had flipped up the loose tunic. She gave an inarticulate exclamation. You'll need numbweed on some of those. Manoli pulled away. What good's a beating, then, if it's numbed away first chance? And she dashed out of the hall. Much Mavi cared if she hurt anyhow, except that a sound body works harder and longer and faster. Her thoughts and her misery spurred her out of the hold, every swinging stride she took jarring her sore back. She didn't slow down because she'd the whole long track in front of the hold to go. The faster she went, the better, before some auntie wanted to know why the children were out of lessons so soon, or why Manoli was going green picking instead of teaching. Fortunately, she encountered no one. Everyone was either down at the dock cave unloading or making themselves scarce to the seaholders' eyes so they wouldn't have to. Manoli charged past the smaller holds, down a ways on the marsh road, then up the right-hand track south of the half-circle.
I've never wanted to kill a fictional character so much.
She'd put as much distance between herself and Seahold as she could, all perfectly legitimate, in search of greenery. As she jogged along the sandy footpath...
How long until the end of the chapter? Sheebus.
2 pages. As she jogged along the sandy footpath, she kept her eyes open for fresh growth, trying to ignore the occasional rough going when she'd jar her whole body. Her back began to smart. She gritted her teeth and paced on. Her brother, Alemi, had once said that she could run as well as any boy of the hold and outdistance the half of them on a long race. If only she had been a boy. Then it wouldn't have mattered if Paterian had died and left them harperless. Nor would Yanis have beaten a boy for being brave enough to sing his own songs. The first of the low marsh valleys was pink and yellow with blooming sea beach plum and marshberry, slightly blackened here and there, more from the low-flying queens catching the odd thread that escaped the main wings. Yes, and there was the patch that the flamethrower had charred, the one thread infestation that had gotten through. One day, Manoli told herself she'd just throw open a window's steel shutters and see the dragon's charring thread in the sky. What a sight that must be for certain. Fearful, too, she reckoned, having seen her mother treat men for threadburn. Why, the mark looked as if someone had drawn a point, deep groove with a hot poker on the man's arm, leaving the edges black with singed skin. Torley would always bear that straight scar, puckered and red. Thread score never healed neatly. She had to stop running. She'd begun to sweat heavily and her back was stinging. She loosened her tunic belt, flapping the soft runner beast hide to send cooling draughts up between her shoulder blades. Past the first marsh valley, up over the rocky hump hill into the next valley. Cautious going here. This was one of the deep boggy places. No sign of yellow-veined grasses. There had been a stand last summer 2 humpy hills over. She heard them first, glancing up with a stab of terror at the unexpected sounds above. Dragons? She glanced wildly about for the telltale gray glitter of skyborn thread in the east. The greeny blue sky was clear of that dreaded fogging, but not of dragon wings. She heard dragons. It couldn't be. They didn't swarm like that. Dragons always flew in ordered wings, a pattern against the sky. These were darting, dodging, then swooping and climbing. She shaded her eyes. Blue flashes, green, the odd brown, and then, of course, sun glinted golden off the leading dart-like body. A queen. A queen that tiny? She expelled the breath she'd been holding in her amazement. A fire lizard queen? It had to be. Only fire lizards could be that small and look like dragons. Wares certainly didn't, and Wares didn't mate midair, and that's what Manoli was seeing. The mating flight of a fire lizard queen with her bronzes in close pursuit. So fire lizards weren't boy talk. Awed, Manoli watched the swift, graceful flight. The queen had let her swarm so high that the smaller ones, the blues and greens and browns, had been forced down. They circled now at a lower altitude, struggling to keep the same direction as the high flyers. They dipped and dashed in mimicry of the queen in bronzes. They had to be fire lizards, thought Manoli, her heart almost stopping at the beauty and thrill of the sight. Fire lizards! And they were like dragons, only much, much smaller. She didn't know all the teachings for nothing. A queen dragon was gold. She mated with the bronze who could outfly her, which was exactly what was happening right now with the fire lizards. Oh, they were beautiful to behold. The queen had turned sunward, and Manoli, for all her eyes were very long-sighted, could barely pick out that black mote and trailing cluster. She walked on, following the main group of fire lizards. She'd bet anything that she'd end up on the coastline near the Dragonstones. Last fall, her brother Alemi had claimed he'd seen fire lizards there at dawn, feeding on fingertails in the shallows. His report had set off another rash of what Paterian had called lizard fever. Every lad in the Sea-Hold had burned with plans to trap a fire lizard. They'd plagued Alemi to repeat his sightings. It was just as well that the crags were unapproachable. Not even an experienced boatman would brave those treacherous currents. But if anyone had been sure there were fire lizards there, well, no one would know from her. Even if Paterian had been alive, Manoli decided she would not have told him. He'd never seen a fire lizard, though he had admitted to the children that the records allowed that fire lizards did exist. They're seen, Paterian had told her later, but they can't be captured. He gave a wheezing chuckle. People have been trying since the first shell was cracked. Why can't they be caught? They don't want to. They're smart, they just disappear. They go between like dragons. There's no proof of that, said Paterian, a trifle cross, as if she'd been too presumptuous in suggesting a comparison between fire lizards and the great dragons of Pern. Where else can you disappear to? Manoli had wanted to know. What is between? Some place that isn't, Paterian had shuddered. You're neither here nor there. And he gestured first to one corner of the hall and then toward the sea dock on the other side of the harbor. It's cold, and it's nothing. No sight, no sound, no sensations. You've ridden Dragonback? Manoli had been impressed. Once, many turns ago. He shuddered again in remembrance. Now, since we're touching on the subject, sing me the riddle song. It's been solved. Why do we have to know it now? Sing it for me so I know that you know it, girl, Paterian had said testily, which was no reason at all. But Paterian had been very kind to her, Manoli knew, and her throat tightened with remembered regret for his passing. Had he gone between, the way dragons did when they lost their riders or grew too infirm to fly? No, one left nothing behind going between. Paterian had left his body to be slipped into the deeps, and Paterian had left more than his body. He'd left her every song he'd ever known, every lay, every ballad, saga, every fingering chord and strum, every rhythm. There wasn't any way a stringed instrument could be played that she didn't know, nor any cadence on the drums at which she wasn't time perfect. She could whistle double trills as well as any wary with her tongue or on the reeds. But there had been some things Paterian wouldn't, or perhaps couldn't, tell her about the world. Manoli wondered if this was because she was a girl, and there were mysteries that only the male mind could understand. Well, as Mabby had once told Manoli and Sella, there are feminine puzzles that no mere man could sort, so that score is even. And one more for the feminine side, said Manoli as she followed the fire lizards. A mere girl had seen what all the boys and men of the Sea-Hold had only dreamed of seeing. Fire lizards at play. They'd ceased following the queen in her bronzes and now indulged in mock air battles, swooping now and then to the land itself, and seemingly under it until Manoli realized that they must be over the beaches. The sand was slipping under her feet. An unwary step could plunge her into the holes and dips. She could hear the sea. She changed her course, keeping to the thicker patches of coarse marsh grasses. The ground would be firmer there, and she'd be less visible to the fire lizards. She came to a slight rise before the bluff broke off into a steep dive onto the beaches. The Dragonstones were beyond in the sea, slightly hidden by a heat haze. She could hear fire lizards chirping and chattering. She crouched in the grasses and then, dropping to her full length, crept to the bluff edge, hoping for another glimpse of the fire lizards. They were quite visible, delightfully so. The tide was out, and they were exceedingly busy in the shallows, picking rock mites from the tumbled exposed boulders, or wallowing on the narrow edging of red and white sand, bathing themselves with great enthusiasm in the little pools, spreading their delicate wings to dry. There were several flurries as two fire lizards vied for the same choice morsel. In that alone she decided they must differ from dragons, for she'd never heard of dragons fighting amongst themselves for anything. She'd heard that dragons feeding among herds of runner beasts and wherries was something horrible to behold. Dragons didn't eat that frequently, which was as well, or not all the resources of Pern could keep the dragons fed. Did dragons like fish? Manoli giggled, wondering if there were any fish in the sea big enough to satisfy a dragon's appetite. Probably those legendary fish that always eluded the Sea-Hold nets. Her Sea-Hold sent their tithe of sea produce, salted, pickled, or smoked, to Ben and Weir. Occasionally a dragon rider came asking for fresh fish for a special feasting like a hatching, and the women of the Weir came every spring and fall to bury or cut withies and grasses. Manoli had once served Minora, the head woman of Bend and Lower Cabins, and a very pleasant, gentle woman she'd been too. Manoli hadn't been allowed to stay in the room long because Mavi shooed her daughters out, saying that she had things to discuss with Minora, but Manoli had seen enough to know she liked her. The whole flock of lizards suddenly went aloft, startled by the return of the queen and the bronze who had flown her. The pair settled wearily in the warm, shallow waters, wings spread as if both were too exhausted to fold them back. The bronze tenderly twined his neck about his queen's, and they floated so, while Blues excitedly offered the resting pair fingertails and rock mites. Entranced, Manoli watched from her screen of seagrass. She was utterly engrossed by the small doings of eating, cleaning, and resting. By and by, singly or in pairs, the lesser fire lizards winged up to the first of the sea-surrounded bluffs, lost quickly from Manoli's sight as they secreted themselves in tiny creviced weirs. With graceful dignity, the queen and her bronze rose from their bathing. How they managed to fly with their glistening wings so close together, Manoli didn't know. As one, they seemed to dart aloft, then glided in a slow spiral down to the Dragonstones, disappearing on the seaside and out of Manoli's vision. Only then did she become conscious of discomfort, of the hot sun on her welted back, sand in the waistband of her trousers seeping into her shoes, dried as sweaty grit on her face and hands. Cautiously, she wriggled back from the edge of the bluff. If the fire lizards knew they'd been overseen, they might not return to this cove. When she felt she'd crawled far enough, she got into a crouching position and ran for away. She felt as rarely privileged as if she'd been asked to bend and weir. She kicked up her heels in an excess of joy, and then, spotting some thick marsh grass canes in the bog, snicked one off at the waterline. Her father may have taken her guitar away, but there were more materials than strings over a sounding box to make music. She measured the proper length barrel and cut off the rest. She deftly made 6 holes top and 2 bottom as Paterian had taught her, and in moments she was playing her reed pipe. A saucy tune, bright and gay because she was happy inside. A tune about a little fire lizard queen sitting on a rock in the lapping sea, preening herself for her adoring bronze. She'd a bit of trouble with the obligatory runs and found herself changing keys, but when she'd rehearsed the tune several times, she decided she liked it. It sounded so different from the sort of melody Paterian had taught her, different from the traditional form. Furthermore, it sounded like a fire lizard song, sprightly, cunning, and secretive. She stopped her piping, puzzled. Did the dragons know about fire lizards?
Probably.
It's the end of the chapter.